and we've got, I want to get into our agenda. Basically, guys, this one is sort of a session on coping writ large. And we're very fortunate to have a number of excellent speakers to talk to us about various things. Samantha will go first, followed by Karmel, and then by Karastan, and then finally by me. Sam will cover a lot of well-being stuff. Karmel will talk about resilience. And Karastan has a great talk about, essentially adapted from her extensive experience in dealing with disasters. And then mine will be about academic coping, especially for early career people. What can you do to sort of make things easier, make things work? Okay, we'll have time for questions after each talk. The way to ask a question is down at the bottom. There's a Q&A box. Type your question there so that we can queue it and get it answered. So we're going to kick off with Samantha Meltzer-Brody.
Okay.
Sam is a professor and chair of the Department of Psychiatry at UNC Chapel Hill. She's also a PGC member, and she runs the Major Depression Group's Postpartum Depression Initiative. And she's got a huge clinical research and training component there. But she also has a second life as sort of one of the world's experts on well-being among healthcare providers and academics. And Sam's got a talk that she'll give on that. And so Sam, will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Pat. Just gonna get this sharing and sharing. Okay, can everyone see that? Great.
Yep, it's good, go.
Great, okay. So I'm gonna talk about mental health and well-being as survival guide. And this was put together with my colleagues at UNC. They're not obviously on this morning, so I will be paraphrasing some of this. And one of the things I think that's important for all of us to acknowledge is that this is an unprecedented situation for most of us in our lifetime. And we prepared a webinar that I'll be giving an excerpt from, was really to help our healthcare providers. This was made for UNC. There's 35,000 employees across a very large public healthcare system, and really to help everyone on the front line figure out how to cope during this difficult time. So one of the things that's really important is how we protect and maximize our coping in a constructive way and decrease destructive coping. And people will experience a vast range of emotions when confronted with any kind of crisis. There's anxiety, your own, and from those around you, given the uncertainty of the situation. People can experience difficulty concentrating, both due to the anxiety and the complexity and the sort of information overload. Some people start looking very hypervigilant. They can feel highly responsive to stimuli, startle easily, feel everything feels extremely intense. They feel very like hyper aroused. That can lead to a lot of irritability, having a short fuse, anger, feeling everyone's on your nerves. For people that are then in quarantine with their families, their living space may suddenly feel like it shrunk 50%, and it's really becoming extremely difficult to deal with people around you. We can see lots of people engaging in catastrophizing. The end is near, we're never going to get on the other side of this, and really start losing hope in that way, having a hard time getting out of really negative thought cycles. People can get locked into weird belief systems, even if inaccurate. So there's still, when you look at the efforts to do social distancing, there's some people that think this only impacts older people because that was early information and they've locked into that, even though it's clear that that's not the case. There are other people that become extraordinarily altruistic and take an altruistic approach to coping, this selfless concern for the well-being of others, and that's how they manage it. So they are really into giving to everyone around them and helping in a way which really allows them to cope with the situation. And then there's the denial people, everything is fine, there's nothing to worry about. And so many of us are employing a range of coping skills using a range of different ways of defense mechanisms, if you will, getting through this. And you may recognize in yourself something that seems more prominent on any given day than others. One of the things that's important to highlight is that the people you're living with, your family or your coworkers or friends, you may realize, wow, my way of coping is dramatically different from someone else. And that can cause conflict. So just putting that out there and acknowledging that really everyone is doing the best they can during this really challenging time. And so the conflict between people can be based on if you are a stressed, anxious, hypervigilant type of person versus the people that are party on, this is all fine kind of person, then it can really cause a lot of conflict. You may notice these things playing out. And one of the best ways of dealing with it is just to be honest and have conversations together. Common psychological symptoms: distress, the fear and worry about your own health and the health of your loved ones. You may notice change in sleep or eating patterns, something I've been calling COVID-induced excessive snacking behaviors that can lead to really maladaptive ways of COVID-induced excessive, alcohol use or other drug behaviors. Some people are having enormous difficulty sleeping or concentrating or just feeling really exhausted. And the movie Leaving Las Vegas, dating myself to the 1990s, Nicolas Cage and Elizabeth Shue, the destructive coping skills around drinking yourself to death or deciding every day it gets overwhelming, and rather than, one drink a day, it suddenly becomes an enormous amount of alcohol. We're really asking people to keep tabs on how are you coping, and are you coping in a way that would be considered constructive or destructive? Because on the other side of this, we want people to come out intact and not come out in a really bad place. One thing we do know is panicking and leading to chaos does not make it better. And so we are seeing some people just start swirling around like a chicken with their head cut off. And we can understand that there's enormous anxiety, but in general, panicking is not going to make it better. If you feel that you're having feelings of panic or anxiety that are overwhelming, then that's a real signal to get help. And so one of the things we're looking at is what's a spectrum of what would be considered normal, appropriate anxiety given the stressors we're facing versus what seems to be really swirling anxiety that feels out of control and means that you may need to get additional interventions. So what are some constructive and positive ways of coping? It's vital to take breaks from watching, reading, or listening to the news. And so if watching, reading, or listening to the news is just making you extraordinarily anxious or making you feel unwell, then really limiting that and putting that only in discrete bursts or taking a break altogether. Limiting time spent on social media can be very helpful for some people. Monitoring your own stress response. What are you seeing? And more importantly, or sometimes as important, what do others observe about you? Asking someone you're living with or you're working with, how am I coming across? And sometimes it can be very different than what you thought. Making sure you're practicing self-care and healthy behaviors to the extent possible, making sure you're engaging in social interaction. There's a whole new genre of virtual happy hours and game playing and ways of connecting with people that's really important and can be quite helpful. Connecting with people and sharing your feelings. There's, in lots of ways you can be doing that, from talking to a friend or family member virtually or to or someone you're living with, or getting mental health support online. And so really encouraging people to reach out and do that as needed. And not being ashamed and really getting rid of any previous stigma you may have had about seeking formal mental health support. Now more than ever, it's so critical. So I think that Anne Frank, who was the young woman who lost her life in Nazi Germany in Amsterdam, and Anne Frank's diary is, a very, very wonderful, albeit poignant book, is quoted as saying how wonderful it is that no one need to wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. This comes from a PBS NewsHour show, and I think that we really have the opportunity to try and improve our little part of the world every single minute working through this. And I think you'll hear multiple different talks today on how we can do that. That's really important. There are many famous people that have said, in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity, In times of great stress or adversity, it's always best to keep busy, to plow your anger and your energy into something positive. And doing something that is productive is a great way to alleviate your emotional stress. Get your mind doing something that is productive, from none other than Ziggy Marley. For our healthcare workers and anyone on the front lines, they face unique stressors because they're having to be self-monitoring and pacing, working in partnerships with teams, dealing with critically ill patients, dealing with the threat of infection. And so we really are working very hard with them to figure out how we're intervening, how we're helping them get real-time support, how we're working with our docs in the intensive care units and the emergency room to debrief after shifts. Really how we're trying to foster a spirit of fortitude, patience, tolerance, and hope, and getting people to reach out for help and having multiple different ways of helping. And I think for all of us, that's something that's really important to figure out. I'm just going to lastly touch on some ethical issues we're all facing. My wonderful colleague, Gary Gala, gave this talk in a webinar, but really thinking about it that we're on one team, and whatever team you're on, this was meant for UNC Healthcare, you're thinking about what team are you on? And if it's your scientific team, how can you be working constructively with your scientific team? That you have to take care of yourself. It's not optional, it's essential. And so how we're meeting basic needs, how you're doing physical distancing, how you're taking care of people around you. For people on the front lines, they're extremely worried about what they're bringing home, and you may be too. I won't talk about the PPE thing for this group, but for anyone involved in healthcare, that's a critical part of what we're worrying about. And then the concept of moral distress, when one knows what's the right thing to do, but institutional constraints make it nearly impossible to pursue the right course of action. This can cause many areas. This comes up in many different areas, and there's lots of teams working on it. And if you're having issues around moral distress in your own life or your own group, finding someone to talk to about it. So I'm going to stop there and be able to take questions as needed, and I'll get back to the Zoom show and stop sharing my slides. So hopefully I'm back to the main page.
Sam, thank you very much. Okay, questions for Sam? You can either use the Q&A box to enter a question, or in the participant box, you can raise your hand. If any questions, please. Then let me start by asking one while we're waiting to see if anybody has anything. Sam, is there any just sort of, if you could advise people, what are the 3 things they should do every day? Just sort of general tips or strategies that might help. What would you say?
So I think that every day people need to be connecting with others in a way that feels nourishing to them.
Okay.
So feeling lonely and isolated, reaching out and connecting with someone virtually or otherwise that is going to feel emotionally nourishing to you is really important. And I think it's interesting how people may say, I didn't realize that how nourishing it would be for me to reach out to, a high school friend or a college friend or a family member you haven't talked to, but really trying to reach out to people that are going to feel restorative and helpful to you. And making a point that you do that every single day. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you're engaging in some sort of stress reducing activity. That can be any number of things, and it will be different things to different people, but you need to put that into your day every day because this is unusually stressful. And the third thing is that you really are being mindful of your news and social media consumption every day and putting a limit on it. Do not, stay up weird hours into the evening, just sort of surfing the web for new news. So really being mindful of those 3 things, nourishing yourself, actively doing something that reduces stress, and really limiting the amount of inflow of news in a way that's going to interfere with sleep or is just causing you to be consumed in it. I think those 3 things are all really important.
Thank you, Sam. And there's a question from Anonymous. How do you let go of the guilt of not being as productive as you, quote, typically are?
Yes. Well, I think that you are spending an enormous amount of your emotional energy right now just managing this crisis. I like to tell people that the amount of your energy going into managing everyday things is so exhausting. And there's a whole concept of moral fatigue, which is when you suddenly have to decide, are you going to touch the box that your takeout came in, and trips to the grocery store suddenly start seeming like a life or death proposition. The amount of anxiety that you are managing on day-to-day routine things that generally you wouldn't think about at all, really are draining your energy. And so you're going to be exhausted, and no one is going to be as productive. It's impossible. And really just tabling that. So I'm saying no ego here, no guilt, no blame. It's just completely unproductive. It is, how do we get through minute to minute, day to day, doing the best we can, and practicing as much self-compassion for you and for everyone around you as humanly possible. So I would take all, guilt around that and, put it away. You're not going to sit there and write 37 million manuscripts. For somebody who's able to do that, great, but for the overwhelming majority of people, no way. And just realizing that you're losing about 50 to 60 or 70% of your battery charge that you normally have every day just to managing your internal emotional state. And that's why you feel exhausted, and that's why it's difficult to be productive.
Okay, and there's no more questions. Samantha, thank you so much for the talk. I appreciate
my
the
pleasure.
words and the wisdom.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, next will be Karmel Choi, who's an early career researcher in the Harvard orbit. And many of us know her from her selfless and super work in various groups. And she's got has a strong professional and personal interest in resilience. And so Karmel, please.
Thanks, Pat. And thanks so much, Samantha, for those important reminders about our mental health, and Pat for the invitation to present. So I'm going to be wearing two hats for today's presentation, one as an early career researcher myself, and the other hat will be someone whose clinical training and research has focused specifically on stress and resilience. So over the past few weeks, anxiety and stress have risen around the world as the coronavirus outbreak has reached basically every continent except for Antarctica. And in the face of this, there has been a lot of talk about coping and resilience. Now, some things we might think of when it comes to resilience are staying calm and not letting things get to us, remaining productive or continuing our business as usual, or even using all the nice ideas and coping strategies that everyone is sharing right now. And on the surface, these things might look like resilience, and some of you may be lucky to find yourselves here. I know personally, I haven't achieved any of these over the past few weeks. And in fact, expecting this kind of resilience in ourselves can actually create more stress. So what might resilience really mean in this situation? To take a step back, broadly, psychological resilience has been defined as the maintenance or recovery of mental health and functioning in the face of risk or adversity. Steve Glatt and John Hess have been leading efforts to study resilience to genetic vulnerability, but here I'm focusing on resilience to life adversity. Our group with Murray Steen, Jordan, and others has been conducting genetic studies of resilience, and last year we put forth this framework that many of you have now seen. So while there are heritable traits like cognitive functioning or optimism that can shape our capacity to maintain or recover our mental health during challenging times, we now know that resilience is better thought of as an ongoing process that involves the interplay of genes and environments. And importantly, it can be boosted by what people do, as well as the supports and resources in their environments. So capacity, but more likely to be a process. And how do we boost resilience? So for this week, I was actually thinking about some things in our world that we might consider to be resilient. For example, a good bridge is built to take in shocks and return back to its equilibrium. Some metals like titanium have high impact strength, which is to say they can bend under a lot of physical stress without breaking. And then there's water and plants, which can encounter obstacles in their path and still move around them. And so a key property across all of these is their flexibility to change or adapt based on the presenting challenge. On the other hand, we can think of things that are not so resilient that simply try to resist stressors without allowing for some impact. And this actually makes them more rigid and likely to break under stress. So what could we do then to face current challenges with resilience? The first resilience idea is to simply allow for impact, to acknowledge all the reactions that are happening. So during this time, there are at least 3 types of challenges that I think all of us have faced in one way or the other. So we've experienced major disruption at every level of society. Everything has changed: where we go, what we do, how we do things, and we're no longer working under normal conditions, especially for those who are parents or caregivers. And some of us who also wear clinician hats are now redeploying or figuring out new logistics for our patients. And in the face of all of these disruptions, stress, frustration, or even guilt about not being able to function as we normally would is completely understandable. We've also now experienced a great deal of uncertainty around this pandemic. So how it will unfold, when it will end, what its ultimate impact will be on the world around us and our loved ones. For early career folks like myself, this might also include uncertainties around next steps and opportunities, the timeline of short-term appointments, and unknowns in the processing of grants, protocols, hiring, and other steps for moving forward. And in the face of uncertainty, anxiety is a very normal reaction. And finally, many of us have also experienced losses. We may lose a loved one too soon without being able to say goodbye. Right now, we are all separated from each other, friends and family. Routines, opportunities, and moments have also been lost. Some of us may have been looking forward to new positions or projects that are now on hold, or to milestone defenses or major life events that have now been delayed, changed, or canceled. And in the faces of losses, both big and small, it is inevitable that we feel sadness, disappointment, or even anger. And if you're feeling any of these things, it's not because you're not resilient. It's because you are a human being who is dealing with disruption, uncertainty, and loss. And to be resilient is to allow for this impact, to recognize that difficult circumstances come with difficult feelings. Research suggests that trying to power through or ignore these feelings actually makes us feel worse in the long run. On the other hand, acknowledging our feelings as they are helps us move through them and let them go. So a resilient response might look like naming these feelings, recognizing that these are normal reactions to what's happening. And if they still feel like a lot, finding a way to express them, whether via journaling or sharing with someone you trust. And also remembering that there is no right or wrong reaction to have during this time. So if you've had some positive moments or felt excited about good news, that's okay too. It's more about acknowledging all the reactions that we are having as we go through this. The second resilience idea is to recalibrate our expectations. So as the person who asked the question suggested, as part of academic culture, many of us already operate under the pressure that there's always more work to be done, that the work might not be good enough, or we might be letting other people down. And so now that we're in the middle of a global crisis, these pressures are only amplified by the fact that we are more distracted and maxed out than ever. Last week, I told someone that my brain feels like it's moving through molasses, and I've certainly not had more time for hobbies or analyses. We're not just working from home, we are working at home in the middle of a pandemic. So this is not normal by any means. And as Samantha mentioned, our brains are hard at work just processing all of the disruption, uncertainty, and loss that is happening. And so resilience in the face of such an unprecedented crisis doesn't mean jumping right back into what we normally do. A resilient response might be to match our expectations to current reality in a way that allows us to move forward when we are ready. So in a crisis, one of the most productive things that we do know to do clinically is to stabilize. Even one predictable thing a day, like a familiar wake-up time, ritual, or routine, can be really helpful as an anchor point during changing times. And no matter what this looks like for you, giving yourself permission to prioritize what is stabilizing for you for as long as needed. So for some people, you may have already found your new normal, and for others, this can be an ongoing process. There is no timeline for this, and it's a marathon, not a race. So it's important to be kind to yourself and to others as well, recognizing that this may also not be a linear process. So some days might be better than others. And here, talking to yourself in a balanced way is also helpful. So instead of saying, I should be more productive, saying something like, I'd like to be productive, and that hasn't been the easiest lately. Or instead of saying, I have to get things done, saying something like, I may get less done right now, and I'll still do what I can. So recalibrating in this flexible way isn't being lazy. It actually supports our resilience in the long run and keeps us moving forward. The third resilience idea is to flexibly choose our coping strategies. So when it comes to coping, the options that you have and how you choose between them can really help. And here's a simple exercise that I've presented recently that I helped develop with my grad school mentor to illustrate this. So imagine just for a second that all the stress you've been carrying around for the past few weeks is in this bag. And to lighten the load, we could start by just taking out all the rocks and looking at what's there. So I'm stressed about childcare, I'm stressed about loved ones getting sick, I'm stressed about how projects will move forward, I'm stressed about how to help, and I'm stressed about the economy, and so on. And looking at each one, you can then decide, is this something that is changeable or is it unchangeable? If something about this stressor is changeable, then it makes sense to apply a problem-focused approach, which tries to change or resolve the situation that's causing the stress. So if I'm stressed about projects being stalled, a problem-focused strategy, as Andrew and Catherine have been encouraging in the MDD group, would be perhaps to brainstorm with colleagues, identify options and alternatives, list the steps that I can take right now and take some of those steps. And Pat will talk more about some of these concrete strategies. On the other hand, if a stressor is unchangeable for now, then it may make more sense to turn to emotion-focused strategies that take care or manage how I feel, even if I may not be able to change anything about the situation itself for now. So if I'm stressed about loved ones getting sick and I've already done everything I can for them, then an emotion-focused strategy might look like accepting that this is going to be hard, talking to someone about how I feel, focusing on what I can control, like breathing, or even trying to help or encourage others. And Samantha gave some excellent tips for self-care that I'm not going to repeat here. The takeaway from this is that this process itself is a cognitive behavioral tool that you can use anytime, where you can take a look at what is most stressful right now, ask yourself what's changeable or not changeable, and then choose a strategy accordingly. And this process does two things. The first thing is that it engages our thinking brain at a time when our emotion brain might be really highly activated. And this shift to prefrontal control is actually something that can help us regulate our emotions more effectively. And the second thing is, of course, it gives us more flexibility in how we cope. So instead of having just one go-to strategy and being really rigid about having to do that, we know that we can actually flexibly adapt how we cope based on the situation at hand. So the fourth quick resilience idea is that resilience is an ordinary magic. So studies have shown that humans are actually built for resilience and adaptation. We've done it before and we'll probably do it again. So it might be worth taking a moment to consider, what hard things have I made it through before? Chances are you've probably made it through some pretty challenging times already. So what helped then, and how can we draw on those lessons now? And the last idea of resilience for now is to integrate current realities. So there's no doubt at all that this situation is something we would never wish upon the world for any reason, and there's no need to find a silver lining. But we do have the capacity and the opportunity to integrate what is happening with how we work and how we live from here on out. So if and only if you are ready, here are some things that might be worth considering. The first is, does this crisis reveal some pressing questions about mental health or biology that our field should be tackling going forward? Could we engage our analytic skills or knowledge or resources to help during this time? And here I'm thinking about folks at Mount Sinai or King's College and so many others. who've done this. And certainly we're realizing that we need each other more than ever before, and this ultimately can inform how we collaborate, how we support each other, and do our science. And then finally, what are we learning about who and what is important to us in life, and also what we want our society to look like? So these are just some questions. And so in closing for now, what can make us stronger and support our resilience right now is not necessarily powering through or staying calm or being fine, but it's really allowing for impact by acknowledging any and all feelings that we might have, recalibrating our expectations in a productive way, choosing our coping strategies flexibly, drawing on our past resilience, and then finally integrating what we can when we're ready. So with that, I'm open to any questions, and then we'll turn it over to Kirsten.
Karmel, thank you so much. I've asked for questions or for people to raise their hands. The questions get entered into the Q&A box, and if you raise your hand in the participants box, we'll call on you and you can say something. Karmel, I really, really love your bag of rocks metaphor and all the stuff that follows from that. Have you guys put that into any sort of training type thing or web, or is there some way that people could actually go deeper in that metaphor?
That's a great question. So it was initially developed for a coping intervention for traumatic stress that we were delivering in Cape Town, South Africa. It's based on a framework that was developed by psychologists 30 years ago. But we thought this illustration was a really nice way to break it down. So that intervention has been manualized, but we also have made a version of this, diagram, if I can go back to it. Oops, and I can't. We can make this particular diagram available. We can send it out via the PGC listserv as well, if that would be helpful.
Thank you very much. Super talk.
Thank you.
And there are no questions.
Great.
And we'll have an open question time at the end, so perhaps we'll have more questions then.
Sounds good.
Okay, next, I'm sure that Kirsten needs an introduction for very few of you, and if you don't, well, look her up for Christ's sakes. Kirsten is one of the leads of the PTSD group, and unfortunately, this particular topic area is hitting awfully close to home for her, in the sense of what she's been doing professionally over the course of her career. Kirsten, please, thank you so much for talking with us today.
I'm muted, and I'm yeah, hold on. What am I doing here? Okay, here we go. All right, thank you. Thanks, Pat. I'm happy to be here, and I'm gonna try not to be too much of a downer. This is the stuff I focus on all the time is trauma and disasters and stress. So I'll give some background on that and then some ideas about moving forward. I think, as everyone on this call would know, the COVID-19 pandemic is an extreme stressor that has multiple characteristics toxic to mental health that we've known for a long time. And these are just some images from the pandemic. This one up here, the one in the right-hand corner of my screen, is the signs in the park across the street in Brookline, and pictures from my own grocery store where pasta still seems to be in low supply. And these are slides from Karmel, which is just highlighting some of the characteristics of the pandemic that we know are really tough on our mental health. And that's novelty. Obviously this is the first global pandemic, well, in 100 years, I guess. Threat, unpredictability, the news changing every day, lack of control, and this affects. And the virus itself has all these qualities, but just this morning we're talking about our school's going to be closed till the end of the year, our summer camps happening, who in our families are going to have jobs, etc. So a lot of uncertainty, threat, loss of control, novelty. On top of that, there's the issues of social isolation with social distancing, and for some people, really significant social isolation if you live alone or you're in a high-risk group. People are facing bereavement. Good friend of mine from college, I got a call yesterday. She has family in New Jersey, and she's already lost her father and her 52-year-old cousin to COVID. And then groups are facing stigma. Originally, it was Asian Americans, but then there's reports of people who are recovering from COVID facing stigma. So a lot of toxic things to mental health. And we also know that the adverse mental health consequences of other pandemics have been well documented. So we actually do know something about this, perhaps not at this scale. So, for example, research in Hong Kong found that in the SARS epidemic, there was an increased rate of suicide among older adults related to the syndrome, but also related to the social isolation. There's been follow-ups of SARS survivors years later and found that they have, and even though they've become physically healthy with relation to SARS, they have a lot of comorbid mental health problems, as well as suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome. And some of that seems to be linked to, again, the quarantine and social isolation they experienced during the epidemic. And studies and follow-ups of people from Ebola affected areas a year later found really significant rates of PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And we do have research from China that's been coming out of people have been following, mainly in the Lancet, that shows adverse effects on mental health. So some in healthcare workers finding high rates of mainly anxiety and depression following the epidemic there. Finding a lot of, Sam talked about this, but high rates of anxiety and depression related particularly to a lot of social media exposure about the outbreak in China. They're talking about rates of like 48%. And then there's been a recent article talking about the public mental health crisis in the pandemic in China. And I've been hearing this from colleagues in Italy and Spain. I didn't have time to incorporate it, but there was a letter in Biological Psychiatry that came out I think it was just released this week from a Spanish psychiatrist. So that's a downer. So what can be done? So many people have been arguing we needed a concerted public health effort to address the mental health in the COVID-19 pandemic, and in addition to the efforts that are going on with infectious disease. So one of the things we've been thinking about at Harvard is how we could come up with a Do the Five that, if you remember this, if people have seen this in Google, the Do the Five with helping to stop the coronavirus, the infectious disease aspects of the pandemic. Can we think of something related to Do the Five for mental health? And on another talk, I posed this and posed my ideas, and one of the callers came up with something better. So I'm taking her idea here. And this is Leah Orlinsky, who's a research assistant at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. So she proposed this 5 for mental health off of what I've been talking about. And so the first thing she said is recognize the problem. And I think we're doing that here on this webinar. And I think both Sam and Karmel talked about recognizing the mental health impact in ourselves and also in our communities, because the first step in solving a problem is to recognize that it exists. Secondly, efforts to expand the social safety net are addressing mental health. That may not be how they're pitched, but they really do have a long-term positive impact on mental health. And you can see that. So things that the stimulus package, halting evictions, improving unemployment benefits will mitigate some of the adverse effects of the pandemic and reduce some of the adverse mental health impacts. The other thing is assisting those most at risk. So who's most at risk in terms of mental health problems? Persons with current mental health problems. So people who went into this epidemic who already struggled with mental health problems, particularly severe and persistent mental illness, are at risk and have really received very little attention in terms of the media. Persons suffering from addiction, families with high conflict or histories of domestic violence. I had made this slide a while ago, and just this past week in the New York Times, there was a report on increased domestic violence calls. When you have families under stress and then you force them all to stay home together, that's going to increase tension. Families with special needs children, anyone socially isolated, and healthcare workers, and so on. So there's a lot of different groups that are vulnerable here. And so what can we do? We can find a way to help. So this is just an example from my community. I'm on this neighborhood listserv, and people have organized to get masks and make masks for the community, for different community centers, for hospitals, and really everyone is pitching in on this as a way to help. But also I wanted to say that doing science is helping. Really, this is, you know, I'm a scientist, so I'm biased here, but I really believe it's science that's going to save us from this. Right now, we need to be doing social distancing and these other measures, but people like Ben and Mark from the PGC are working on the genomics of COVID, and many people in our communities, probably people on this call, might be working on the genetics of COVID, expanding testing in terms of technology for testing, treatments, vaccine, and then understanding this disease in terms of preventing future outbreaks. So doing science is helping, and also doing your own science is helping. This is not to put more pressure on yourself, but if you can, if you can, that is something that's important. You don't necessarily have to be out there doing something very specifically COVID related. Doing the work is contributing. The other thing we've been working on, and also in this webinar, is cultivating resilience. So we've been having these mental health forums, and Karmel actually has a talk on, if you go to the link for this, she's done a talk on resilience on these. We have one coming up this coming week, which is on sleep problems and how to avoid chronic sleep problems before they get started. And these are open to the public. A lot of other people are doing similar things. And then finally, having empathy. It's something we talk a lot about in our group, is having empathy for ourselves and each other's. And I also think Sam and Karmel talked about this specifically. And one of the things that that has given me hope in this is the empathy I've seen in my own community. So these are just pictures. I have a 10-month-old puppy, so I'm out walking the dog every day, no matter what, rain or shine. And these are some things I've seen while I'm out there, people posting signs on their porches, thanking people doing deliveries. And then this morning I noticed that someone is putting little painted rocks around the neighborhood on the ground with words on them. So there, live, smile, call your mother was on one rock, etc. So those kinds of things actually really show a level of empathy for the community and for strangers. So you're reaching out to people that you don't even know. And I will end with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karastan. Questions for Karastan, please. Again, in the Q&A box or in the participant box. Karastan, while we're waiting for any questions, let me ask you one if I could. Is there anything, so this talk has shifted a little bit more toward the larger scale, the bigger picture stuff.
Yeah.
Is there anything the PGC could be doing? What could the PGC do that we're not doing now that could actually be of a positive net benefit?
Well, that's a good question. Because I know a lot of different individuals are doing things, and some people I know are being called, some of the psychiatrists in the PGC and psychologists who normally focus on research are being called to do clinical work. So people are individually, I think the kind of thing we're doing now, I mean, we see there was now 85 people on this. I think one thing the PGC has in common is we're all really aware of mental health. So if there's ways that we can help whatever our communities are, acknowledge that impact and do reach out around our expertise, I think that is one way we can help and make sure the voice of mental health is heard in this and doesn't get drowned out by all the other urgency. So I think those are some things.
Because I think you're right. I think, if you think about especially the subset of people that have the truly chronic, truly severe mental illnesses, they're without question going to have disproportionate mortality. They're not going to seek treatment appropriately, that they'll have the comorbidities that will increase it. In addition, I think a lot of us, Sam has mentioned that there's been this huge uptick of people who are really stressed out, reaching out, looking for help. And in addition, there's also, I think that this will be a huge downstream risk factor for psychopathology in the next 5 years. So I think, we're going to see a lot of PTSD in healthcare providers and all that. So, okay, there's Howard Edinburgh has a comment, which is tipping those who are helping you, delivery people, etc. They don't earn much and are on the front lines, helping plus empathy. Absolutely. Great. Yeah, so if you do your Instacart or your, you can often leave a tip. And I certainly encourage people to do that. That's a great thing to do. Abe Palmer says, go ahead, please. No,
No, I was going to say supporting small businesses in your communities is something that people have been trying to do in different ways. That's also.
Oh, absolutely. There's the Chapel Hill Wine Store. I'm really trying to help them out as much as I can.
I'm helping out the wine. I've become a frequenter of the wine and cheese store.
Ah,
that is one of my coping mechanisms.
got it. Comment from Abe Palmer. These talks are very helpful. Thanks for doing this. Getting these ideas in the media just mentioned now would be helpful. I have no specific questions. Thank you, Abe. And then there's 2 questions in the box. Anonymous says, do any presenters or participants have suggestions for having meaningful and empathic conversations with collaborators, PIs, trainees, students, when expectations are mismatched? Okay, that's a great question. If you're struggling and if the PI is pushing you, or if you notice somebody's struggling, et cetera, what do you do? Great question.
Yeah, so I can say a little bit in terms of the more leader side is, I hope I'm doing this, but I specifically, and I've heard of other people doing this too, is sending out, so we've been getting these emails from various institutions, which felt like they were saying like, oh, you're on sabbatical now, you should be more productive. So sending out messages to your group, sending out messages to your group saying like, recalibrating expectations. And the other piece is, I think leaders you could be authentic yourself about what you're dealing with. Because people pay more attention to what we do than what we say. So if we, show that we are, I think we can be self-revealing about our own struggles. I'm gonna be honest about them. I do think there's a chance now for more authenticity in relationships. Like I've learned things about colleagues I've had at Harvard that I've known for 15 years. Some of them never talk about I didn't know they had kids, but now we're Zooming in their home and they're saying like how they're locked in their bathroom talking because they can't stand their teenagers anymore. So I think there's some authenticity. I don't know if people have ideas for people who are in the sort of, your supervisor is still being grueling kind of.
Yeah, so the first thing, of course, is just to, find a way to give the PI or the supervisor some feedback.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's possible. Some people are receptive, some people aren't. If that works, if the direct approach works, great. If not, then I would suggest an indirect approach. Usually it's possible to find somebody who's in the hierarchy who can talk to the person with you anonymously. So in other words, HR can do this kind of stuff. You could reach out to your human resources person, say that you feel like your PI needs to back off a little bit, and then they could have the conversation anonymously. Alternatively, there might be a colleague, a peer of the PI whom you could approach, and you could say, hey, you need to tell this person to lay off for a little while. I think that there's probably, if you think about the problem, there's probably a good solution there. Kirsten, does that ring true to you? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that makes sense. Absolutely.
Okay, next question is from Hermine Moss, and the webinar is being recorded. Yes, it is. Can we share the link? Yes, we can. Basically, these should appear within the next 24 hours or by Monday, certainly, on the PGC website. There's a worldwide lab meeting tab on the website. And if you go there, that's where these things will appear. Tammy, I believe we also put this onto the YouTube channel. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I'll put the link in the chat.
Great. So we'll get that out. Okay. Next, there's an anonymous question. I'd love to hear how folks are approaching research activities right now. It seems that everyone and anyone is adapting their current research to respond to the pandemic. This is critical, but I worry about the short and long-term consequences in terms of keeping important work unrelated to the pandemic moving forward.
Agreed. I can say a few thoughts about that because I have areas that are directly related in both. So I have one set of things that was closed down. Unfortunately, like our projects in Africa and Mexico, which are direct person human enrollment, they're closed. They're nothing to do with trauma, PTSD, COVID, or whatever. So what we're doing is we are at a halfway point in those projects. So we are focusing on 100% on data cleaning, analyzing, and writing papers. So that is, all those efforts have moved to that. Those people have nothing, they're doing nothing with COVID, they're just doing their job, but refocusing. And then we're also doing some training. So we were doing a SCID training because we were going to do a SCID validation. So we're going to have webinar trainings on the SCID for our collaborators while this is going on. So that's like something that's nothing to do with COVID. And then I have an ongoing big cohort study that's on stress and aging. So of course, the COVID, and it's partly in healthcare workers. So COVID is very relevant. So in that case, we pivoted and created a questionnaire that will incorporate COVID. But we are doing, and then sort of PGC PTSD, we're moving ahead with our Freeze 3 analysis. Some of us are involved in COVID things, but to be honest, it's a relief even for me to sometimes not focus on COVID. So we've been pivoting. I'm sure other people have other answers, pivoting in different ways.
Okay, thank you. So Howard mentions can also use mentoring committee. So I think that was meant to be sort of a partial answer of how to handle the PI, I think.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that, Kirsten? So mentoring committees, how do they play into this?
Oh, well, ideally, if you have a couple, if you are not relying on one mentor, but if you have a mentoring committee, this would have other people you could speak with, but also perhaps you could raise these questions with more than one person at once. So you're not just dependent on taking it on with, your PI. But and also committees, I think PIs themselves can influence each other. Mentors can influence each other where you're in a co-mentorship situation. Reach out to your co-mentor and say, hey, these are my expectations. I think we need to get on the same page. So the sort of PIs mentors themselves can help influence each other to recalibrate expectations.
Makes sense. 2 more questions, and this may be a Karmel one or a Kirsten one, I'm not sure. How important is it to remain hopeful during this pandemic? What can be its underlying mechanism to deal with stress?
Great question. I'm happy to take a first step and
Let
feel free
Karmel
to jump in. Yeah, I think that in a time where there's so much uncertainty and stress, that the importance of positive emotions are really an asset right now. So things like optimism, hope, and gratitude are things that are things to hold on to. So when we are stressed, our attentional processes tend to narrow quite a bit. And that helps us focus more on threat and things that we should be sort of careful about. But sometimes when we are sort of stressed for too long, then we might be missing sort of other things that can help us cope or, act more effectively. And so what things like hope and gratitude do is they actually sort of open up the cognitive sort of processes to include sort of more details that might be helpful for us trying to work and be productive or even sort of know what to do next. So I would say that is really important right now.
Ooh, it's essential, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I'll touch on that a bit in my talk.
Great.
One last question. Thank you, Karmel. One last question. Do the psychologists, psychiatrists on this call have any suggestion for talking to older family members or relatives who may be in risk groups who are not taking it seriously? How to help them understand urgency of self-isolating without scaring them too much? I think there's a short answer and a long answer to this. Kirsten, you may well have a link to the long answer, but maybe the 2 of you guys could talk about the short answer real fast. Kirsten, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we can send a link to the short answer is, I guess the short answer is, well, you provide them with the information, which they probably already have it. And information sources they respect, like, will they respect, CNN or, UNC? And then the third thing is, you can model it. So like other people follow our behavior more than our words. So it's hard to tell your mom to stay in if, you're not totally following the rules either. So I think if you wear a mask, your parents are probably more likely to wear a mask, etc. You can also use grandchild guilt. I use that a lot. I think that's quite effective, more effective than child guilt.
Karmel, any comments on that?
Great.
Okay, good. Kirsten, thank you so much. And thanks for the questions. And we'll rotate to my talk now. Okay, I'm talking about academic coping. And this one is especially geared toward early career researchers. And this, of course, is the bloody virus that's doing this all. And it obviously has been the great disruptor. And when I think about stuff like this and the impact it has, the first thing I go for is what might be an organizing framework. And I essentially dug back into intro psychology that I took ages ago on my screen. There we go. And this is a Wikipedia lifted image from Maslow's famous pyramid or hierarchy. And basically he posits that in order to do the top thing, all the other pieces beneath it have to be in order. And if you think about it, this virus, this pandemic actually hits pretty much all of them. So we have a situation where there's a physiological part down at the bottom where, I'm spending a lot more time thinking about food than I ever have before. Stopping off at Whole Foods to get something is not really a thing that I do without thinking a lot about. Some people, of course, are having shelter being threatened with eviction and difficulty making rent and all that. Obviously, this hits directly at safety. Going outside is not necessarily safe. All of us are faced with a real threat to their health. The impact of social distancing or physical distancing obviously is huge, especially for single people, or especially for people that find themselves in a household of people and everybody's now getting in everybody else's nerves. Obviously, a lot of what we do about self-esteem is based upon how we function in society. If we can't function the way we're used to, that can take an impact. And then, of course, up at the top is what they call self-actualization, this sort of, hippy-dippy sort of thing. A musician must make music, an artist must paint, etc. And look, we're scientists. Scientists got a science. And of course, there's the fact that all toilet paper supplies are being impacted in a way that hasn't happened before. And again, I've spent more time thinking about toilet paper in the last month than I have in my entire life combined. I guess part of it too is, what are some guesses as to where this might go? And this is, I'm going to use a storm metaphor, that this is a once in 200-year storm. And this is the map from today as to where the amount of deaths are. And it's pretty scattered. There are parts of the world that aren't hit right now, but they're likely going to be hit soon. And there's variability by country and by region. There are places where it appears as if, and I hope to God this ends up being the case, where the storm is past. In China, South Korea. There are places that are worried about a second wave or a second storm coming, for example, Singapore. There are places where the storm may well have peaked. People are certainly hoping it has, and may in fact be starting to lessen. Italy, Spain, Austria, for example. There are places where the storm is either at or near a peak, Europe, Northwest Europe, New York City. And there are certainly places with a variable national response, such as Sweden. There are places where the storm clouds and the winds are starting to pick up. Much of the states, for example, appears to be that way. Certainly here in North Carolina, that's where it is. And then there are other places where it hasn't hit that much right now, but it very likely is coming. And there's a couple of true unknowns. I mean, I don't think we really know for sure about whether there are in fact virus carriers or reservoirs for it. That will be something that'll be critical if that appears to be the case in the future. A true game changer is that if people, obviously science and biotech and biopharma are working super hard on trying to come up with treatments for lung disease. If the lung disease can be prevented or greatly minimized, that'll be a game changer. And then obviously if a vaccine becomes available, that will be something else important too. But I think this was mentioned before, I think we need to be super careful about the assumption that young people are safe. We don't know. One of my friends has had it, and he's a month out from the acute infection, and he's still screwed up. There's a lot of things, there may be long-term consequences that we simply don't know about right now. And so let's be careful about that assumption. The key thing is not to get it if you can avoid getting it, I think. And then finally, in North Carolina, where we are right now is that we're basically sheltering at home, essential travel, essential services only, and this will be the case until June 1st. We got an email from Sam, actually, Sam Meltzer-Brody, who talked earlier, saying that psychiatrists may be called on to cover primary care and internal medicine so that those docs can go to the hospital and help out in the need there. And so I think, we need to see where things go, but this is sort of my guess as to where things might go. And now I've got some academic coping ideas for people to think about. The first one is literally what she said. The previous 3 talks were fantastic, and there's a lot of wisdom, a lot of things to consider there. And again, we'll post this talk if you want to go back and look at that again or talk it over with your people. I think the Maslow metaphor, I think, is a very useful one. You've got to get your base in order, and because you can't do anything if you can't get that in order. And maybe, in fact, you can't get it into order. It's impossible right now, and that's fine. We'll talk about that next. But even if that's the case, be a scientist, for God's sakes. Define the problem, seek to understand the problem, and try creative solutions and experiment until you can find a fix. So that's my first top level thing. The second thing really comes down to what your scenario is. And I've covered 3 or 4 of these, and first 3 go right here. The first thing is some of our colleagues have professional obligations which are leaving them 0 time for science. There's a lot of my colleagues that are having to do a ton of clinical work because basically that's the priority right now. And obviously, you got to do what you got to do. If your profession needs you, if the vow you took when you became a doctor, or the professional obligations you feel as a psychologist or social worker or whatever, if that means you got to do immediate care, well, then you have to do that. And there's other of us, of course, who have a lot of family obligations that, for whatever set of reasons, having to take care of a couple of kids at home, to do homeschooling, to make sure the kids aren't going stir crazy, and to be a parent in a stressful time, that may, in fact, in reality, leave minimal time for science. And of course, people might get ill. And if you're sick, you got to take care of that, right? There may be 0 time. But there are some things you can do from an academic perspective. But first of all, you have to acknowledge, look, it's okay. Do what you got to do. This will pass. So even if it means that the next month or 2 is pretty screwed up for you, we'll get past this at some point this year. And my advice basically is, first and foremost, to communicate. Make sure that everybody knows what's going on. Tell your boss, tell your mentors, tell your teams, tell your colleagues. And I also think it's always worth doing from an employment. This is just sort of like, working in an organization 101, document it. If you need to get sick, if you're sick, take sick leave. If you need, if there's a way for you to take family time, do it. Vacation time if need be. Talk to your human resources. Get a letter put into your file. You can write that letter to explain what's going on. I think many places have now automatically extended the tenure clock by a year. And if your institution hasn't done that, and if that's relevant to you, for God's sakes, do it. Talk to your funders at the NIH about extending the duration of your grant. I mean, if in reality you can't do something because of an external constraint, well, then you have to play that card. Make sure everybody knows. If you have pressing deadlines, make sure those deadlines take into account the things that are happening on this page. The key thing, and also of course, play the act of God card if you can. If you go back and look at contracts, many of them actually have these force majeure clauses. And go back and read those and see whether, in fact, that's applicable and whether there's an aspect there that you need to know about or that you can use to your advantage. Literally thousands of people are going to be in exactly the same positions. I strongly suspect that if we push them hard, the systems will adapt to this. But we have to basically make sure that we have these steps in place. Some of my colleagues have talked to me about actually reducing their efforts on grants. I think there's advantages and disadvantages there. One advantage is that if you reduce the effort that you're charging to a grant, that will extend the grant, and that can be a good thing. But often that means for many people that will reduce their household income, and that can be certainly a bad thing. So think this through and think through the pros and cons, and definitely talk to your mentors about whether that's worth doing. Okay, another scenario is my base is okay. I've got the time, I could do work, but I just can't. And again, it's okay. And a lot of what the previous talks have talked about was dealing with this scenario, when in fact you're just too preoccupied, stressed out, whatever. And clearly, look, pandemics are a huge E in the G by E equation. And the question here then is, can you find a solution? And I think my advice is basically be a scientist. And Karmel actually, with her bag of rocks metaphor, actually really got at this. Define the problem. Try to understand the problem. Try to mess around and experiment till you find a solution. But I also think it's important to be practical. In my group, we use a US baseball metaphor, the 3 strikes metaphor. Try to fix a problem yourself 3 times. And if you succeed, fantastic. But if you don't, ask for help. Because try and fix the same problem the 4th time, the 5th time, the 6th time, it's pretty unlikely you're going to fix it. This is the clear flag that you need to reach out and ask for help. I also am big on goal setting. In other words, if you're having trouble working, fine, then go back and set an easy goal for each day. Make a calendar, write the goal down, see if you can get it done. See if you can actually find somebody else who's in the same situation to help support you in doing that with the goal setting idea. But also, I think more broadly, define whether you have a need. Do you need a mentor? Do you need to contact your mentors if you don't have one? Do you need to develop a mentorship team if you don't have one? If you do, can you activate it? Do you actually need somebody who's outside the mentoring chain to act as a coach? As several people have said already, do you actually need a therapist? I mean, that's one of the great things about therapy is you can do it over the internet, right? Zoom is a great thing for this kind of thing. Look, I mean, it's clear that many of our colleagues have had a lifetime psychiatric disorder that did well with medicines. If you're on medicines for this would be a really dumb time to cut back. And if this, to the extent to which this might be a trigger or a stressor or something that might reactivate something, consider going back on medicines prophylactically. Obviously talk to a doc about this, don't just do it yourself, but this is something to think about. And then there's some practical things. Do you actually need a week completely off? Do you need to find a way to get 3 consecutive nights of sleep? In other words, to try and help restore yourself. Nourish yourself was the word that Sam says. Most of our institutions have a whole wide range of health resources, including up to and including talking to people about what's going on. UNC has it, Karolinska has it as well. Use those. This is an example of the lab tracker that I've developed for my teams. Basically, I have people put in a weekly goal, and then they have a short-term goal for each day of the week. Saturday and Sunday is there just to be clear rather than to be explicit that I expect people to do anything, because I don't. And then we also have, it's over to the right for each week. Did your environment allow you to work? Were you able to focus? What do you need that you don't have? Did you make your goal? I actually asked my people to complete the GAD-7 and the PHQ-9, which are basically ways to track anxiety and depression in a 2-week time slot. I don't want to know the scores, but I want them to take a look at it. And if things start to track up, then is this something that we need to talk about, or I need to help them find some way to deal with it? Okay, in general sense, look, it's if you can, as you can. If you can means if your Maslowian pyramid is actually in a position where you can do it, super. It may change. There may be a week that really sucks for whatever reason, or somebody gets sick or something else happens, fine. Again, if you can, as you can. Another general advice is to make a good home workspace. If you look at this website called Wirecutter that I like a lot, they have great suggestions about how to make a home workspace. The one key thing that you can do right away is to actually get a damn 27-inch monitor. If you're looking at a laptop like I am here, it really is a huge problem. One way to make your productivity so much better is to get a big monitor, which I have right here. The other thing is the scheduling stuff. Set a time, set a goal, get a daily written schedule happening. And again, if there's any repeated problem that you run into, define the problem and find a fix, and ask for help if you need to. Other specific things I would argue is the following: team up. There's strength in numbers. Communicate, ask for help, meet with your mentors, activate your mentor team. Find somebody in your network with a massive data that needs to be written up. If you have the space and time and think you can do it, fine. Find somebody that's got more data than they can handle themselves. See if you can define a project that you can work on together. What about a peer group? There's other people that are going to be in your situation. Set up a support network. Meet once a week over a glass of wine, whatever. Work it out. And obviously, work on a project and team. Somebody else might be driving a project. You might be able to contribute. Do so. But don't forget, the PGC also has masses of data. Since we're sort of a data science, dry lab type thing rather than a wet bench, there's plenty of papers that can be written. Ask the group leaders for ideas. The depression group has started doing a bunch of stuff like this, and definitely contact Andrew and Catherine because they will have things to work on. The other thing, of course, is use this as a structured way to learn something you've been meaning to learn. Maybe you want to pick up R. Maybe you want to learn how to do whole genome sequence analysis, whatever. If you have the time, if you have the energy, and if your pyramid allows, consider it. The PGC responses, we've got a bunch of things going, and there's certainly more we can do. We started a week ago with the coordinating committee with a big session on leadership. How can we lead effectively during this time? We're piloting right now a PhD clinical psychologist-led coaching curriculum for early career researchers. The first meeting was yesterday. There's going to be 8 sessions. If it works and if it's valuable, we'll try to manualize it, make it more widely available. There's certainly other ways to do this, but I think we should get working on this as well. I'm hoping to plan more worldwide lab meetings. In particular, I want to develop a syllabus for those who are new to the PGC. When all this passes, we're trying to get a lot of new investigators into the PGC, many from non-European countries, and we're hoping to have a syllabus to basically help people get up to speed. I think, longer term, we should look at studies at the, basically the pandemic as a near universal E in the G by E equation. Again, learn something like I mentioned. And then finally, the PGC has masses of data and there's papers to write. So ask group leaders for ideas. Next is the following. I'd like to ask for help. How can the PGC help? Are there ideas? Are there needs? Do you want to volunteer? What else can we do? Please send an email to Grace or to Tammy or to myself. Grace's email is right there. Subject line, ** PGC request or PGC idea. 1-line summary, a few sentences describing, and we want to know. We'll collate these and see if we can do something to respond to the needs that are out there. But the PGC has a bunch of resources. We can do things, but we need to know what people want us to do. So please do this. And then finally, the only words of wisdom I have are this will pass. This is not going to last forever. The next month or two will certainly suck, but then I think we'll see that things improve, I hope. Be smart, be careful, attend to your base, and team up. There's strengths in numbers. There's ways to get through this together. The mantras that we have are good enough is enough. And one of my colleagues often sings to herself the theme song from one of the Frozen movies, Let It Go. I haven't gone to that extent, but the phrase actually is quite a useful one. Okay, that's my talk. Happy to take questions if there are any to have. Okay, let's see. So sorry, my computer's a little messed up right now. There we go. Okay. Question from Cynthia Bulick. This is an important question, one I've been trying to figure out for her mom. Okay, so she's talking about, Cindy, this is the long one. Do you want to actually, I can allow you to talk. I'm going to actually flip that. And if it's okay, why don't you, you should be live now, speaking wise.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I was just responding to a question that someone else posted about how do you address older people in your orbit who aren't taking this seriously. And a little bit of self-disclosure, I've been dealing with this a lot. My dad died in January. My mom's all alone, and she was using social connections as a way to sort of deal with the bereavement process and the grieving process. And it's been a real struggle trying to get people who live in this retirement village to take things seriously, which is sort of ironic given that so many of the deaths are actually happening in assisted care facilities and other places where there are a lot of older people together. So I've really been doing everything I can to try to get my mom and her friends sort of connected virtually so they can continue to have their knitting circles or their, they're co-watching shows together on Netflix, whatever it is, to not make them feel like they're having such a loss at a period in their life when they're already losing so many friends and people and husbands and whatever. It's been an incredible challenge, and it's taken a lot of time. And I think the biggest challenge that I've run into is some of them saying, what have I got to lose anyhow? I'm close to the end of life, so what if I die from COVID? And that's been the hardest thing to deal with, but staying connected and finding ways to keep them connected has been a really important way to address this question.
Can you dig up, I agree that video appeared to be quite helpful. Can you dig that up, please?
Yeah, I was starting to look for it, and then I couldn't have like 3 things going on the internet at the same time. So I will do that and try to get that. I'm going to check it for accuracy first, because it worries me a little bit, but it sure did work.
Yeah, it seemed like the one thing that made her take it particularly seriously.
Yep.
And then Margarita thanks us all for these talks. Okay, any other questions for any of the speakers today? Raise your hand, enter something in. Okay, so the final thing is, wait, sorry, there's a couple things. Karen Mitchell, yes, thanks, lots of great advice. I'm recommending the recorded version to lots of colleagues. Awesome. Chelsea Bachman, would you please provide a template for the weekly tracker? Yes, I will post that or send it around. And Margarita has a question. Margarita, I'm gonna make your microphone live. Give me a second. Okay, Margarita, you should be able to speak now.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I was writing my question, but it is better if I do it like this.
Sure.
I would like to ask you, how do you manage the time? Because I'm having problems because we are all at home, and of course we have plenty of things to do. I'm teaching, also supervising students and online teaching, etc. And also I have research to do, a lot of papers to be written up, etc. So because I am at home and I have my computer and I can work, I feel that I have to be working all the time. So if I am at home doing different things, I feel guilty because I'm not working, which I have so much work to do. So I think, I don't know how, I don't know if you have this the same problem or not, or you have a certain time that you say, I'm working at this time and then stop. Doesn't matter, I will continue tomorrow with work. So this is just to get some ideas from you guys on how can I cope with these things.
Marguerite, I think virtually everyone has that issue right now. I'm going to turn this comment to Karistan or Karmel. I think it's a great question.
Well, I certainly can't say that I've been doing it successfully or well, but as time has been going along, the recognition that time can just bleed into itself and the days start to become like Blur's day, that can really be addressed by time blocking, I think, to the best extent that is possible within the constraints that you face. So just like Samantha recommended, taking breaks from media, having sort of blocks of time that, if possible, will be used for working, and then after that, really giving yourself permission not to sort of think about it. And what Pat was saying earlier in terms of, really checking in with what you need. Maybe it is, for example, for me last week, I literally took an entire day where I didn't think about work at all. And to some extent, I had the luxury to do that, but it was also very much needed in terms of mental health and just getting space. And then I was able then to return back to the work that needed to happen after taking that time. So kind of really being flexible about that, but also recognizing when you need to take more time and block that out.
Thank you, Karmel. I think this is a super important question, so I'm going to ask both Karastan and Cindy to respond, please. Karastan, do you have any sage comments here? Okay, Karastan. Okay, Cindy, did you want to?
Yeah, I can dive in on this one. And this might sound super simplistic, but at times like this, I think going back to Pat's pyramid, sometimes that's really important. One of the things that I've been suggesting people do is actually sort of get up, put on your work clothes, identify and ring fence your work day by when you have your work clothes on. If you're a makeup wearer, put your makeup on, brush your teeth. And then at the end of your workday, take your work clothes back off and put on your sweats and your fuzzy boots. One of the things that my people have been saying is when they work in their pajamas all day, they lose that clear line between what's work time and what's relax time. And sometimes those very simple interventions can help you do your time blocking appropriately and making sure that you're not really into this sort of 24-hour workday vortex that really does have the potential of sucking us all in. Because, I mean, face it, we could all work 24 hours a day, but that's not going to help our mental health or our physical health at all at a time like this.
Thank you. Okay, great question from Barbara. Does anyone have any recommendations for coping with grief at the same time as managing anxiety? Fantastic question. Who would like to grab it?
So I'd like to mention that on Wednesday this past week, there was a session at the School of Public Health that targeted coping with loss and grief. And clearly it's something that a lot of people are encountering now, both with the loss of loved one and so many other losses. So that recording is available for people to, if that would be helpful. And yeah, it's clearly something that will be affecting all of us in different ways right now.
Excellent. Karmel, if you could actually pop the link to that into the chat box so that
Sure.
she can see it. But I also think this is a situation where that's one thing, but it's also, I think, got to keep in mind that there's resources out there if that's not enough. Maybe, that you can do something that by watching a video or looking it up and finding some recommendations. And if that's enough, fantastic. But I would suggest people should have a low threshold for asking for help. And how you do that depends upon where you are. And if, again, one of the advantages of being the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium is there's a lot of professionals in the orbit. So ask me, ask somebody, ask Cindy, Karastan, Karmel, ask Sam, whatever. Somebody will be able to answer the question or help you figure out what a good next step might be if doing something simple isn't enough. Okay, anonymous question. Many people have mentioned feelings of guilt in relation to their work life. This is something that I have also dealt with throughout life. This might be a good opportunity for people to spend some time reflecting on why they feel guilty. It's an opportunity for self-discovery. That's a really interesting perspective. Comments? Karmel, Karastan, and Cindy, we've sort of drafted you onto the panel. Anybody want to comment on that?
I'll dive in. It's Cindy again. I've been writing about this in my Psychology Today blog about how this is one of the single most important times for you to not be hard on yourself. And I think all of the speakers talked about that. And, so many of us who are in this field have these perfectionistic tendencies anyhow. And placing those perfectionistic demands on yourself during a time when so many of your resources have been co-opted just toward basic survival, it's just painful. And, I've been talking to all my people, whatever phrase is in your head, give yourself a break, cut yourself a break, lower your expectations by 50%. I think one of the best lines I heard from one of my people, and she's someone who is at home with 3 kids of different ages, so she's homeschooling them. She's a full-time professor of psychology, and she's teaching classes. She said she wakes up every morning and she makes a to-do list, and then she cuts it by 50%, And then she goes and does something else and she comes back to it and then she cuts it by another 50%. And then it might be an achievable goal. And then on top of that, when she does achieve something, no matter how small, she makes sure she pats herself on the back, because anything we accomplish right now, given everything else we're facing, is something worth patting yourself on the back for. So yeah, I think this is a great time to lighten your expectations and to really, instead of looking at what you don't achieve, really turn your perspective around and look at what you do achieve.
And Cindy, if you could paste in the links to some of the blog posts. I found one of them, which is the 8 tips to avoiding the COVID-19 divorce.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, guess where some of the, Cindy and I are husband and wife, so guess where some of the stuff came from. Chelsea Bachman says, do you have recommendations for communication while remote? Managing the amount of emails, communicating with others when you're stressed, reducing miscommunications, etc. What a great question. Who wants to grab it?
I think regarding communicating with others when you're stressed, there's rarely been an email that has worked out very well when I've sent it when I have a lot of emotions or when I am stressed. And so one thing that has been really helpful has been to sort of sit on some emails if I have the chance, and sort of come back to them. If they're urgent, then being able to respond quickly is important. But most of the emails that we get can be addressed with a little bit of a delay. So giving yourself time to cool down and go from a hot mode of your brain to a cooler mode and then respond will probably result in less regretful emails. And yeah.
I'm writing a couple of, my 2 cents in this are, first, cut your expectations as we discussed. I mean, I think, you might have taught people that you respond to everything same day or same hour or same minute, whatever, 3 months ago. Not now. Everything slows down, and that's fine. As long as you get to the important stuff, that's good enough. If you're delayed, if somebody asks you for something and you simply can't do it, just let them know. Just communicate. I think Karmel's points about intentionality in email make sense. If you're pissed, don't send it. Cool off, think about it, come back to it, whatever. The whole idea of being nice to each other is really critical right now. And I think anything that adds negative energy to the universe isn't helping, to be perfectly frank. And if it's really tricky, then don't email, call them. Call them on the phone, FaceTime, Zoom, whatever. I think having a personal touch is probably a better way to go on average. Anybody else have anything on the email and communication overload idea? Okay. The next question in the Q&A box is, harking back to the what can the PGC do? Recent trends signify the exasperation of the crisis in the US may be driven by health disparities among ethnic groups. Absolutely. Mortality rates among people who are not European are huge. This is true for every disease, including COVID and the PGC disorders. As PGC investigators, what steps are we taking to reduce health disparities, especially considering that many of our samples are high SES and of European descent? That is a fantastic question. And I think the answer is a long one. And I'm wondering if in fact we should have a PGC call exactly on this topic. I think it's a big thing. I don't think I know enough or could do enough to answer it. And I think it's sufficiently important that maybe we should actually spin that off into a full-scale thing. Ms. or Dr. Anonymous Attendee, would that be an acceptable answer? Okay, I'm going to actually take chair's prerogative. Okay, anonymous attendee agrees. Sounds interesting. Thank you. We'll do that. Hillary, if something good happens, publication, colleague being recognized, student graduating or finding position, share it. Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much crap news these days. Let's definitely keep good news going. There's also a PGC-wide listserv. There's a Google group. And if you're not on it, I suggest actually reaching out to Grace to add your name to it, because that's one place where you can actually amplify stuff like that. That would be actually fine. And don't forget, there's also the PGC Twitter account, which is another good way to sort of amplify papers in particular. Academic stuff, we're, send it to them, and then they can sort of retweet it to get it around to other people to their reach. Okay, Hermine, any recommendations on how or how much to talk to people with dementia and Alzheimer's about COVID-19? Wow, that's a tough one. Let me try to grab that, since this is sort of a set of disorders that I've done a fair bit with. I honestly, I think it comes down to common sense. I think the first thing is you've got to keep people safe. And so if they're in a situation, if they're in some sort of care, which of course is a huge, huge risk factor, then you got to make sure that the healthcare facility they're in does everything they can to keep people safe, first and foremost. And then I think a lot of it really depends upon where a person is in their stage of illness. If they're actually reasonably far along, where they're often disoriented, or having trouble recognizing close relatives, if they're moderately or worse affected, honestly, I don't know if there's any advantage to talking about it with them, because A, they may not be able to process it, or process it realistically, or it may be something where you can say, because of the memory impairment, you might be able to tell them exactly the same thing over and over again, and it never sticks. If someone's in the earlier stages, well, then I think it comes down to how you might talk to anyone like them, with some acknowledgement for their degree of cognitive distortion. So those are the priorities I would have: safety, and then tailoring whatever you say to where the person is. Anonymous attendee, do you have any coping advice for researchers who are facing redeployment to assist with the COVID patient surge, or the guilt from hoping they won't be redeployed? Great question. Anyone want to jump on that?
Sure. not that I have a brilliant idea about this, but I think that one is that don't have guilt for not feeling like you want, that you don't want to focus on this, or it might be scary because you might have been I'm working with a lot of people who've been out of clinical, including myself, who could be pulled in, who's licensed, but haven't actually done a lot of direct patient care recently. So it's sort of anxiety provoking. And then the other thing is, I think that you really have to, going back to Pat's talk about where are you at, like, it's just like if you were home and you were dealing with a chronically ill person, or you're managing your kids, you've got to like let go of any expectations regard to your research. So you're not giving yourself expectations that you're going to be doing intense clinical work and then coming home and writing a paper. Those are my initial thoughts. I'm sure others have better stuff.
Yeah, so I think the guilt thing is complicated. There's many of us have gone to medical school because that's what we do, and of course, being on the front line, carries risks, and that's tricky, and it takes away from research. That's tricky too, especially if you're in a situation where that's become your norm. I would argue that I think we need to play the role that we can play. This is a time where, it's complicated, but, patient care really, for many of us, has to be, a priority. So I've actually taken some steps to get my name back in the hat to see patients and all that. I think psychiatry is useful in that a lot of stuff can be done remotely, which obviously is a bit safer. But there certainly are some situations in which psychiatrists who might not have seen a patient for a couple of years might actually be called back into the clinic to do stuff. And I just think, it's a complicated thing, and there's no one size answer fits all here. And I think each of us needs to think through, take some time, talk about it, and try to understand where one fits in one's own personal set of priorities, one's own philosophy toward this. and come out and reason yourself to an answer that works for you. That's what I'd say. It's not a simple question though, and I think that probably the most I can do is by acknowledging the complexity and the need just to really consider it carefully. Okay, I think we're gonna bring this to a close now. So I wanna thank the speakers, Sam Meltzer-Brody for her talk, as well as Karmel, Karastan, and Cindy for chiming in. I really appreciate this, and please, if there's things the PGC can think about doing, send an email. Let's see if we can figure some stuff out. Be safe, everybody. Hang in there, and this will pass.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks,
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.